I thank you very much for the invite. I'm very happy to be here. Um, and I apologize for the very nebulous title, Managing Invader Overflow After Decades of an Open Faucet. I am going to be talking about invasive plants today, so hopefully that doesn't scare off anybody. But I also think that what we're going to talk about today applies to a lot of biodiverse taxonomic groups in general, like insects or other invertebrates. And so hopefully it's not too boring for folks that don't delve into the plant world. So, maybe you're thinking, what is she talking about with this open faucet? And what does that have to do with invasive species? So, um, I'm hoping that you'll indulge me in a sort of metaphor, that this is a metaphor for Hawaii's invasive species problem that just keeps coming. So, as Rashawn said, I got my start in Hawaii in 2015 as an early detection botanist for Kiskunk, Hawaii. So, it was my job to find invasive plants that we could possibly eradicate before they were able to spread. And this experience really shaped how I look at invasive species in general. So, I was from Canada, you see, and even though I spent a lot of my job interview telling the committee that, I was a trained botanist, I secretly harbored these worries that I wouldn't be able to find any of these new invasive plants to support KISS early detection program. I figured I'd be at a disadvantage because I didn't know the flora yet, and maybe these plants would be really hard to find and, quite rare. I worried I wasn't going to find anything, but I need not have worried. So on my very first day in the field, I collected a new shrub invading a wet alien mixed forest on Kauai that had never been recorded in the state of Hawaii before. And then once I started looking more, you just couldn't not find new invasive species. So like dozens and dozens of new invasive plant species that we never recorded before on the island. And it just felt like, as a kid, did you ever try to drink from the sink where the faucet is like open so far that it's flowing so hard that your cheeks flow up and you end up spraying water everywhere and ultimately not really, drinking that much? That's kind of what this job felt like. Just so many species, faucet on full blast, water everywhere, it's getting all over the floor. What do we do? What do we do? Just kind of chaos. And so this is how this talk is going to go. So first we're going to kind of characterize this open faucet, quantify it. So I wanted to ask questions like, how fast are new plants coming in? How are they being introduced? What do we got here? Do we got like a trickle, or is the tap really on full blast? And so I want to show you some of the work that I did for my PhD with Dr. Kurt Daler at Manoa. And then, that leads us to this second problem. Like, you cannot keep the faucet open for too long before, the drain slows, the water overflows, and if you don't get around to mopping it up, you start to see water damage to the floor. So all of the water on the floor, thinking in metaphors, those are those invasive plant species that we've allowed to invade and are now causing serious negative impacts. And so that's part 2 of this talk. So I'm going to present some of my preliminary unpublished results from a PICAST funded project that I'm still working on with Dr. Kirk Daler and Dr. Lucas Fortini. This is a project where we look at invasive flammable grasses. And given that it's not been long since the horrible fires in Lahaina, I'll give a little bit of a trigger warning here. We are going to talk about the risk of wildfire and how that's connected to invasive grasses. But we're not going to address any one fire specifically. And so if that's a little bit too much for anyone who suffered a loss last year, I'll absolutely take no offense if you leave, obviously. But the hope is that at the end of this talk is that we kind of think about what invasive species managers have to think about, where you've got these both well-established species that are doing significant damage, and then you've got these species that have just come in, and you could possibly get rid of them before they start doing damage. And it's not an easy task to decide how you should allocate your resources. So today's talk is going to be light on the technical science side of things, but then heavy on trying
Join the meeting.
in the shoes of managers and planners when looking at this kind of big picture of how to deal with multiple invasive species at the same time. Okay, so here we go. Part one, the open faucet. So like I said, we wanted to first characterize that faucet. So asking, how fast are non-native species being added to Hawaii's flora, and has that rate changed over time? And so by the word flora, I just simply mean all of the vascular plant species that live in Hawaii. So all of the species we've got combined, we can call that Hawaii's flora. And then I also wanted to ask, why are these species being introduced? And so the hope here is that if we could identify some of these pathways for introductions, these like why these species are introduced, maybe we could use that information to inform some future efforts that would aim to kind of just try to shut that tap off a little bit. So to answer these questions, I took Hawaii's naturalized plant checklist curated by the Bishop Museum, and I gathered all the herbarium specimens I could find across the world that had been digitized, available online. And so this ended up amounting to over 275,000 digitized herbarium specimens located at 85 different herbaria from across the world. And I used this information to find the year each species was first considered naturalized on each island. And so I was really conservative in doing this, selecting only species that met the definition of naturalized. And so what naturalized means is any species that is forming persistent, self-replacing populations outside of human care. There are also hundreds of species that are what we would consider questionably naturalized. We don't really know what's going on, or species where we're just finding a few individuals here and there in the wild. And I did not include those because it is not uncommon to be accused of overblowing an issue as an Asian invasion biologist, and I wanted to head that off at the past. And then I also did searches of the literature. So just kind of scanning different online resources to identify the most likely reason for a species introduction. So that's what I'm calling an introduction pathway. So, maybe it was brought in as an ornamental plant, or maybe it was brought in as a food plant. And this is based on searches of the literature. Sometimes I was actually able to discern this from the herbarium label itself. So here's an example of a herbarium label, and you can see there's quite a bit of information to them. So sometimes they even contained, like why that particular or where that species was, and maybe where it had escaped from, like a nearby experimental plot or something like that. So when I was able to analyze the first record of naturalization for each plant in Hawaii over time, here we've got, on the x-axis, we've got time starting with 1900 and then ending with 2020. And then on the y-axis, we've got the total number of naturalized plant species in Hawaii. And so if you kind of follow this line, you can cross-reference it. You can say, okay, at like roughly 1930, we had about 500 naturalized species in Hawaii. And so what I want you to look at here is that basically this line is pretty straight. So it indicates a pretty constant increase in the number of non-native naturalized plants in Hawaii. And it equates to about 12 new non-native plant species naturalizing per year. If you kind of just look at this last 40 years, it's a little higher, like maybe about 14 plants per year, but pretty constant, no like massive upticks or downticks anywhere. I also compared the shape of the line to what I would consider large historic events in Hawaii's history, thinking that maybe some of these might have had some influence on the rate that new plants were being added to Hawaii's flora. And so there are some wiggles in the line for sure, but none of these events seem to really correspond with a major change in naturalization rate And that goes for even some things we'd hope that would result in a decline in invasion rate, like the introduction of regulatory documents like the noxious weed rules. So pretty steady constant rate. And 12 plants per year. So that's just a number. So let's give it some context. So before humans arrived in the islands, the native species were colonizing the islands by natural means. So floating to the islands through the ocean, maybe taking a ride, hitchhiking on a bird species. But they were establishing at a rate of about one new plant species every 100,000 years. And so in Faucet terms, that's like barely a drip compared to 12 species a year. And so 12 species a year, that's like a really incredible change from pre-human times. And we don't really know what the outcome of these species will be, how they'll fit, how they'll impact ecosystems in Hawaii. We're not even close to being able to quantify the impacts they might have on the native species that colonize naturally. But even when we look at the fossil record, we can see that when we have a large number of new species suddenly allowed to enter a new place for the first time, like over a land bridge or something like that, there are major impacts, major extinction events, basically what I can only describe quickly as ecological chaos. So I think it's safe to say that this is not going to be, introducing all these plants isn't going to have no impact. And so 12 plants a year, I'd argue, is a comparatively gushing faucet compared to pre-human times. And this is where it's gotten us. So this is a pie chart that I have here that shows naturalized non-native species in yellow. And you can see that they outnumber native species, which we've got here in green and blue. So naturalized species make up about 55%. So this is about 1,500 species. And again, when I say naturalized, I mean that these are the species that are, forming fully sustaining populations outside of cultivation, persisting for multiple years. If I added species that were questionably naturalized or just beginning to naturalize, this yellow chunk of the pie would be much larger. And then, of course, because of Hawaii's remoteness, when you look at the native proportion, you see that the vast proportion are endemic. So these species that have unique evolutionary trajectories and are not native to anywhere else in the world. And so, it's something that we have to consider in this age of global biodiversity shuffling. Remote islands like Hawaii have the most uniqueness to lose. And so I think that makes it even more urgent to kind of come up with a strategy to prevent further damage to this endemic chunk of the pie here that we have in Hawaii. And here's one last bit of context for you. So I recently did the same experiments for my job in Wyoming, where I'm an extension specialist helping folks manage invasive plants here. And even though Wyoming is 9 times larger than Hawaii, the rate of naturalization is 3 to 4 times smaller at about 3.5 new species per year. And so the tap for Wyoming is open for sure, but maybe it's not wide open like Hawaii's is. In Wyoming, we've only got 500,000 people in the whole state. So I suspect that has something that's keeping the rate down for us. So I always get at least some folks that are not convinced that we should be alarmed by that number, 12 species a year. And that's fair enough. And the reason that they think that is because we don't have any evidence that those species are going to go on to cause problems. And it is very true that we are bad at understanding impacts from invasive species, especially plants, because they tend to be, their impacts tend to be slow, indirect, difficult to measure. But what I can say is this: if you take the species out of Matuka's weeds of Hawaii pastures and natural areas, that's these species on the y-axis, These are these well-known species with well-recognized negative impacts, and you plot them against total naturalizations of all plants, you see that they're directly correlated. So the more you roll the dice, the more likely you're going to turn up a given number. So in other words, the more plants you bring in, the more likely you're going to bring in one that is at least easily recognizable to us as having major impacts. However, you get a different story when you divide up the purpose of introduction, or what I'm calling introduction pathway. So as you can see, the species introduced accidentally, that's this yellow line, it remains, pretty straight throughout history. Forestry species, kind of low early in the century, and then they get a bit of an uptick near the end. But I think what's really interesting is the changes between species introduced for agriculture. That's this green line, and then species introduced for ornamental and landscaping purposes, this blue line. So the rate for naturalization for agricultural plants is higher in the early part of the century and then levels off, while ornamental plants really just start exploding in the last half of the century. And actually, this makes sense. So this is correlated with our economic shift from an agriculture-based economy in the early 1900s to a tourism-based one now. And so you can see in these little figures, gross domestic product kind of, is increasing, human population is increasing. But when you look at acres of active farmland, that really starts decreasing mid-century, right about when you see this line leveling off. And then at about after statehood, in the 1960s and later, you see this massive spike in tourists, and that's when you see this massive spike in ornamental plants. And I think that what that means is that the new tourist-based economy in Hawaii has probably increased the demand for pretty plants. And so, I was kind of surprised by that result. And going back to our metaphor of the open faucet, I kind of like in this scenario where maybe you never lose water pressure, but the city you live in switches its source from maybe mostly groundwater to mostly surface water. And so even though the reason for bringing in plants changed drastically during that mid-century shift from agriculture-based economy to a tourism-based one, we were still miraculously able to keep up that rate of 12 plants per year. So now I think this study highlights the need for prevention to prevent invasions from occurring in the first place. So in other words, let's turn off the tap already. And if you go anywhere on the internet, you find all sorts of guidance saying prevention is absolutely the best strategy. In fact, here's a screenshot of our National Invasive Species Center saying just that on their first page. The best way to fight invasive species is to prevent them from occurring. But a few important studies have come out recently showing that even though it's pretty well accepted that prevention is the best medicine when it comes to managing invasive species, we're not really doing that. In particular, this study looked at it on a worldwide scale. We're not really investing as much in prevention as we are in sort of reactive strategies like controlling species after they've already are well established. And I think that's possibly because prevention isn't necessarily easy. So, many people think, why can't we just prohibit people from bringing in new species? And I totally agree that sounds like a really intuitive way to turn off the tap. And this is certainly not my area of expertise, but people I know who work in the regulatory and policy world know that existing policies have set precedents for the changes that we can do. And so that regulation is tough. That's going to be a tough way to go, at least an incomplete answer for turning off the tap, at least in the short term. But on that note, I think more people are starting to talk about managing pathways for invasive species rather than individual species themselves. with the idea that if you can influence an introduction pathway, then you stand to prevent many species introductions rather than having to identify which species you think you need to look out for beforehand and make a long list to search for in shipments and whatnot. One example of this program in Hawaii is the Plant Pono Endorsement Program, which tries to get nurseries and landscapers in Hawaii to voluntarily stop selling invasive species in exchange from some sort of endorsement. So that would be an example of regulating or sort of trying to manage a introduction pathway. But I think the most common solution we turn to is not necessarily true prevention, but something close to it. So something called early detection or rapid response, often abbreviated as EDRR, where you try to catch that species in the early stages of their invasion. So this is sort of more akin to bailing out the sink rather than turning off the tap exactly. But it's certainly closer to prevention than long-term management. And the problem with managing any area where you've had the faucet open for many decades is that you probably have multiple species that lie somewhere on the spectrum from being relatively recent introductions that might be containable to species that are really well established that are going to require forever management. And so that's what we're looking at here. So we've got time again on the x-axis, the abundance of a particular invader on the y-axis. And this is this classic invasion curve, where at first you've got, the population of that species stays kind of low, and that offers this opportunity to possibly completely eradicate that species before it starts this exponential growth phase where maybe your best bet is that you can only kind of contain it to a particular area. But at least that would be better when the species get here, where it's kind of invaded everywhere it's going to be, and your strategy is basically long-term management and for infinity, basically. And so going back to our metaphor, we've got these species that have just come out of the tap, and then we've got the ones over here that have been hanging around a long time, always already caused some damage. It's going to take some serious ongoing efforts to fix that. And so in invader-rich places like Hawaii, managers are faced with this dilemma. Do I allocate my resources to species that aren't causing problems yet, but are potentially eradicable, and maybe we only have to invest resources in them for a temporary amount of time? Or do I put everything into the species we know are causing problems, accepting that we're going to be doing this forever? And here's where we enter part 2 of the talk, so the rotting floor. And this is where I hope to get everyone thinking about this management dilemma of trying to parse resources across well-established versus what we would call incipient species, those species that haven't had a chance to fully invade yet. And we're going to use invasive flammable grasses in Hawaii as a case study. I like to work on invasive flammable grasses because they're, clearly linked to driving wildfire, and the impacts from that are severe, including loss of human life. Even with the science behind it, though, it can be kind of hard to convince people that plants are really having a major role in causing wildfire. Usually when a news story breaks, people immediately go to who started it? And maybe some of the news outlets, depending on what they are, start talking about weather and climate change. And those are certainly all important factors, but it never ceases to amaze me that we don't often talk about how the landscape became covered in fire starter in some of these drier parts of the state. However, invasive grasses did get some attention in the Maui fires, at least. And I think this is a lot due to Dr. Clay Trauernicht, who is a fire expert in Hawaii, doing a lot of media contacts and whatnot to get set the story straight on invasive grasses. So one of the most insidious things about invasive flammable grasses is that we know that they can transform forests and shrublands into grasslands that are permanently prone to burn more often. And this is what we call the grass fire cycle. It's been pretty well studied, and it goes something like this. So the grass lights on fire easiest because it's basically fire starter. It's very flammable. And then it carries the fire into the forest. And forests are harder to light on fire because the fuel is not as fine. So if you were to throw a match into a pile of grass and throw a match into a forest, probably the one that went in the forest isn't going to catch on fire. But the grass probably is more likely to. And so even though they're harder to set on fire, the grasses kind of provide kindling, if you will, to catch them on fire. And then after they burn, the trees die. So you have a loss of total forest area going on there. And then because most of these invasive flammable grasses are really well adapted to fire regimes, they're oftentimes the very first thing to pop up after the fire and outcompete everything else that's also trying to come out. So you ultimately have this growing expanse of grasslands that used to be partially forest, and that these grasslands are forever, highly flammable and causing more intense wildfires, and you just kind of have this vicious cycle of flammable grassland expansion. And you can see this happening in Hawaii. So the green you see on this map is basically pure monotypic stands of invasive grasses, and the red are wildfire perimeters of fires that have occurred since 1990. And you can see there's a lot of overlap with invasive grasslands. In fact, when I look through the data set, 95% of all wildfires in Hawaii that have occurred over the last 30 years overlap with these non-native invasive grasslands. And so getting back to thinking about established versus incipient flammable grasses in Hawaii, we wanted to ask, could further invasion by these already well-established invasive grasses promote the expansion of flammable grasslands in Hawaii? In other words, have we seen the worst out of our, notorious wildfire promoting species yet? Or could they cause fires in other areas in the future? And we also wanted to ask, will incipient invaders, so those ones that haven't really had a chance to fully invade yet, will they occupy different climates, thereby expanding the area for which wildfire mitigations efforts are needed? Or will they essentially invade the same places as established species? And so we're kind of looking at this problem through the simplified lens of minimizing the total area in Hawaii that is at risk for flammable grass invasion as a management goal. So if the new species coming in have completely novel climate preferences, then they'll expand the total area we need to manage for wildlife mitigation. But if they're just going to live in areas that are already invasible by well-established species, then that's something perhaps that managers want to consider when making decisions about how to allocate their resources between those well-established versus incipient invaders. So the first step, we just identified 6 well-established fire or flammable grasses. And these are likely species you might have heard of. So broom sedge, buffalo grass, fountain grass, skinny grass, molasses grass, little spruce stem. And so these are characterized by having an average introduction time of about 100 years ago. They're relatively widely distributed, so they're on multiple islands already. And then we also selected 6 incipient flammable invasive grasses. So these ones you may not have heard of as much. So West Indian foxtail, pampas grass, jubata grass, thatching grass, kogon grass, silvergrass. And these are all present in Hawaii, but they have an average introduction time of about 32 years ago and are established on 2 islands or less. And then the second thing we did was was model the potential distribution of these species in Hawaii based on their climate preferences, namely temperature and precipitation. We put a lot of effort in to modify the models to account for some of the well-known challenges that come along with modeling invasive species. And I'm just gonna skim over all of that work in the interest of keeping people awake. I'll just say that species distribution models work something like this. So you gather as many occurrence points as you can. So this is where that species occurs on the landscape. And then you overlay climate data, so temperature and precipitation, onto those points. And what this allows you to do is that it allows you to model the relationship between where the species is present and what that climate is like at that location. So you can kind of get at, what climate does that species seem to like? And then you can extrapolate that relationship to make these maps to see how that suitable climate might be distributed across the landscape for a particular species. So that's basically an oversimplification of the idea. I'll leave it there, except with maybe saying that there's a lot of validation that goes into, you don't just produce the map and assume it's true. You oftentimes withhold data. So we withheld 20% of our data to use as validation, so we could actually say, like, okay, is this theme predictive of where this species is going to occur, or is it really just kind of junk? So that was our species distribution modeling, and this is what it looked like for the species we chose. So these ones here are the well-established species. So there's not a whole lot to take away from this slide, except maybe to show that there's quite a bit of diversity in climate preferences among species that are already well established. You can see some have large distribution, or like kind of generalist distributions. Other really like dry leeward sides of islands. And it's the same story for the invasive or the incipient species shown here. So quite a bit of diversity here as well. Some more generalist, some seeming to have more narrow preferences. But the question of, like, what did we make out of all these maps? So I think our first finding was that when you look at all of the well-established species in Hawaii combined, they can cover almost all of the main Hawaiian islands. They certainly are capable of expanding beyond where we currently find invasive grasslands in Hawaii. And so suitable climates for well-established species here are represented in purple on this map. And there's only a small amount of area, maybe at higher elevations and wetter areas, where incipient species could push the expansion of that area that's at risk for seeing is at risk for being invaded by flammable grasses. So basically, the well-established species, we got enough diversity there. They've got it covered. Of that small expansion, though, that's majorly due to this species called Jubata grass. So Jubata grass seems to be one of the only incipient species that can kind of bring in climatic novelty and establish in areas that are not preferred already by the species that are already well established in species or in Hawaii. The other thing we noticed is that if you look at the map here, showing all the well-established species overlapping each other, you have many regions where that area can support more than one well-established species. So in other words, there's enough diversity in the flammable grass species that are well established already to cover most of the islands, but their preferences are also overlapping. And so what this means is that if you were to control one, it's really possible that you'd have reinvasion by yet another flammable grass. I think the major exception to point out is this yellow area on the Big Island that seems to only be preferred by fountain grass. And so you might be able to remove it there and prevent invasion by another flammable grass. It might be invaded by some other, species, but if the goal is fire suppression, invasive grass management, then perhaps control of fountain grass in that area might be worthwhile. And then finally, this other pattern emerged, possibly diminishing returns for investing in EDRR. And I phrase this like a question because I think it's a pretty new idea. And I think we need to talk to a lot more people who manage these areas for flammable grasses and wildfire mitigation before I really understand what this means. But what you're looking at here on the y-axis is the proportion of area suitable for invasion by these flammable invasive grasses. And then on the x-axis, that represents the number of species that have been added. And so what I did here is that I looked at each island and the species present on it, and also the order that these invasive grasses arrived. And so, for example, the island of Kauai, the very first species that came in had the potential to cover about 60% of the island. The second species added has a lot of overlap with the first, so it expanded that area only slightly, and then so on and so on. And each island has a different length because not all of the islands have all of the species yet. But I think the major take home from this is that, you get this saturating kind of trend where every island is almost 100% invasible by a flammable grass by about adding the third or fourth species. Big Island is an exception because we don't have species that can invade the very tops of the volcanoes yet. They're just basically bare lava. And then what's more, these arrows represent the addition of that first species you might still consider incipient, still consider eradicable. So purple for Big Island's first potentially eradicable species, and then the black for all of the other islands. And so as you can see, most of the islands are already completely covered, completely invasible by some species that has already come before, so that preventing the invasion of that incipient species is not going to prevent the expansion of the total area suitable for invasive flammable grasses. The one exception is Maui, this teal line, where if they can prevent the invasion of Jubata grass, they can prevent a 20% expansion in the area on Maui that's at risk for flammable grass invasion. Okay, so I do want to be clear before we move on, about what I'm not saying. I am not saying that EDRR is not worth it in Hawaii anymore. This study takes a really simplistic view of trying to minimize the total extent of invasible area in Hawaii. And real management goals are much more nuanced than that. For example, I know from my own personal experience that having more than one species invading the same area can be worse than one. So, for example, here's some pictures I took on Oahu. And there's this fire where most of the place had been covered by buffalo grass, and this species doesn't like shade at all. And so where only it was present, we didn't see a lot of woody plant burn. But where the guinea grass was present, it seemed to be able to survive in shady areas underneath trees. And so this combination of the two basically allowed the buffalo grass to pass the torch to the guinea grass in the forested areas. And that resulted in these burning of these huge trees of large trunk diameter. So please don't understand me in thinking that I'm not an advocate for EDR. But I think what I am saying is that I'm worried that this might be true. That where you do see diminishing returns on your investment for EDRR for each species that is allowed to invade. And then if you're just starting invasive species management programs after decades of an open faucet, you might see less benefit than you hope than just controlling that species alone in isolation. And so I think the way forward seems to be we need to beware of death by a dozen substitutions, realizing that there's a lot of species out there that might fill the role of causing a particular type of damage, like wildfire. And perhaps the amount of benefit gained from controlling that invasive plant might depend on what's going on with the other species that are already there. So what I call like the invader pool. And there's a lot of species in the invader pool in Hawaii. The example I show here of this is that EDRR strategies likely need to be complemented by long-term management of other flammable established species if we want to prevent wildfire in most areas. And so, for example, if I was looking to prevent the expansion of areas at risk for wildfire on Molokai, I might aim to eradicate this species here because that's the only one of the bunch that can be eradicated. But I might also consider that I have to manage or contain species 4 and 5 in perpetuity in order to have the benefit that I wanted to get from controlling the incipient species, from preventing that expansion up to the entire extent of Molokai. And so this is my final slide. So I think I've lived on Hawaii long enough to have come to the conclusion that there doesn't seem to be any consensus among folks about how to balance the need for new species preventions, dealing with that open faucet, or focusing on long-term species, the ones that are causing the water damage. I've heard both extremes. I've heard people saying that controlling established species is a lost cause, or that we should prevent invasions until we have unequivocal proof that they're worth controlling. And that brings me back to that bathroom faucet metaphor. Like, what do you do when you walk into a room where the faucet is flowing and the floor is rotting? Do you bail out the partially clogged sink only? Do you, bail the sink and try to fix the floor at the same time? Do you sandbag a part of the room that hasn't been water damaged yet? I don't pretend to know all of the answers, but I think what it means is that we've got invasive species managers in between a rock and hard place. Like, we've got to do both. We got to do both prevention and control of well-established species. There's enough invasive species diversity in Hawaii to do serious damage already. And so you can't ignore those well-established species, or else you're not going to have anything left to save. But we've also got to do EDRR and prevention because the number of species that we have to deal with will just keep growing. And so will the pool that we'll need of resources to manage. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for listening. And if I left us any time, I'd be happy to take any questions.